I feel like rambling a bit about alignments again, so let's get to it. Hello everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den with me, your host, Jordan, your Master of Lore and Storyteller Extraordinaire, here to talk for a bit about alignments again. It's been a while since we last tackled this subject. It came up because, recent viewer and commenter had some questions in regards to alignment and also some feedback, just generally enjoyed what I had done, but it's just one of those things where once you open that can of worms and start going down along it, it's hard to kind of stop, because alignment's just such a tricky thing. There's so many ways to look at an alignment, how a character has aligned themselves overall on, good, neutrality, evil, law versus chaos, all of these different things, because to be honest, when you're looking at a person to say somebody is any one thing for any given set amount of time is kind of hard to really establish. We rationalize, we justify, we have extenuating circumstances. There are so many things that can compel us to act the best that we can and really sometimes leave us with no good options. And, does that mean a player's character should be punished by having their alignment changed? Should they go with whatever penalties might be associated with that, especially for classes that require strict alignment guidelines? It's all so very up in the air, and the answer could very well and does vary from DM to DM and player to player. It just really has so much to do with how the individual looks at the alignment systems overall and what they can successfully present to their DM at the table. But before we get into everything on my mind going down this particular rabbit hole, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamer's Den. Or if you've already gone on ahead and listed yourself on such an incredible roster of legendary heroes, then go on down to hit the like button and share the video far and wide. Now, let's just talk a bit more about what a complicated mess alignments can be. They are a useful tool in many different kinds of situations. It can be good to have clear lines of delineation and establishing differences between different sections and groups of people. Those general tendencies that you might find in different regions. That's a very great way, a quick and easy descriptor that puts an idea in different players' heads as to what they might expect for a given location, the kinds of people that they're going to encounter there. But at the same time, a lot of people, the bulk of the people in the world, particularly when it comes to humans for most of our fantasy-oriented games, probably fall in the general neutral category of alignment. In fact, that's usually the recommended go-to point, because most people are generally confronted with all those day-to-day situations that necessitate that they make certain decisions based on the immediate conditions facing them. So they're not necessarily really leaning too hard towards law, towards good, towards evil, chaos, any of these things. They're just going to vary in the moment based on the circumstance. But that right there, some people might look at that and go, oh, that's more chaotic neutral than it is neutral. The chaotic neutral is associated with a great deal of personal freedom, valuing that above all else. It's not necessarily the only key feature, but it is a common key feature that you will find in a lot of different characters and depictions of what might be considered chaotic neutral. Not just the random, craziness, but, still that intrinsically, inherently very personal sense of freedom overall there. And another thing to note when it comes to alignments is that just because somebody is predominantly one particular alignment does not mean they can't exhibit traits and qualities of the other alignments. It just depends, again, on those circumstances, what those extenuating situations and external factors are that go into the decision making. And is it a rational decision being made? Is it a reasonable conclusion to come to? Is it a hard choice? Is it an easy choice? Is it a choice where the player role plays out having regret for the actions later, is trying not to think about it, or doesn't care, or is wholeheartedly and gleefully thrown themselves into it? And depending on what that situation is, any of those could be either incredibly amazing, good things, awful, or just kind of either way. It all just depends, and that's what a big part of what makes alignment so difficult, is that so much just depends. It makes it so difficult, and that's where alignment can definitely be a bit more of a hindrance than a help. I think it's good for establishing general guidelines, and then you use role play and kind of figure things out where things need to be a little bit more specific, like say a player is playing a paladin. Classic example for a lot of lawful good characters. Lawful good is so broad and so just any of the alignments is so broad, but still, lawful good, it's like that can mean any number of things. And the paladin, in most instances and depictions, they've taken several different kinds of vows, vows reflecting their knightly order, the holy order that they belong to, their church, their faith, and hell, churches can have multiple orders of holy knights. So what's the distinctions between them? Those can be hammered out and figured out. Those particular more strict guidelines can be defined through role play and the player and the DM establishing what those orders and vows may particularly be, because even a singular knightly order can have multiple different kinds of vows depending on certain situations. A vow of penitence, a vow of retribution, a vow of vengeance, or any number of things, vows of poverty even, essentially becoming still a knight, still an adventurer, but still is, for all intents and purposes, other than their armor, their shield, their weapon, their mount, they're essentially going to more or less remain destitute, or at least as destitute as they can, giving away their funds, their loot, their gains to either noble, righteous causes to help the needy, or just take it back over to the church. So that can be a way of hammering out those details, but again, that is a specific situation, and it doesn't necessarily address things for every single character class or every single character, and all of that, again, well, it depends. So that can be a point that really trips things up. Recent commenter, the one that kind of sparked all this thought for me, asked what alignment I thought Korra from Avatar Legend of Korra, what her alignment would be, and I fall along the lines of thinking she'd be neutral good, generally along the lines of some form of neutral. In fact, most iterations of the Avatar are probably going to fall into the neutral good category, regardless of the nation that they came from. Now, that can still have some influences, but going back to Avatar The Last Airbender, when Aang is looking for somebody to validate his position on not killing the Fire Lord Ozai, he's like, oh, I'm going to reach back to Yang Chen. She was an airbender. She's going to back my position, looking for confirmation bias, on his decision to try to remain not pacifistic necessarily, but, not taking a life. And she berates him gently, but she goes, Aang, your responsibilities as the Avatar are to the world, and that's more important than your responsibilities as an air nomad. It's much bigger than this philosophy. You're dealing with more than just, your own personal unwillingness to take a life. You're dealing with much bigger forces at play here, and so he has to eschew his old life, his old philosophies and values. Or at least, he was supposed to, until the writers backed out at the last minute and did Deus Ex Turtle and, energy bend away Fire Lord Ozai's ability to be a threat. Well, his bending anyways. neutral good is probably what most iterations of the Avatar fall along onto. Although I could see a true neutral avatar. I could even see a neutral evil avatar, honestly, depending on what the situations might be that crop up and arise to cause that to happen. But because there's a focus on harmony, on balance, and not just within themselves, but within the world, and that also includes the spirit world as well, balance between the spirits, the physical, living beings made entirely of energy, essence, whatever, balance between these multiple forces, and then balance between all the nations themselves, that requires them to sometimes stand against nations, even their home nations, like you see with Avatar Roku, when he stops his friend, the then Fire Lord, from going on conquest against the Earth Nation to try to bring peace to it. This Fire Lord Ozai, or not Ozai, Avatar Roku can, just from his experience in past lives and his understanding of the world at large and the state that it's in, realizes that's going to be a bad plan. That's not going to work out the way he thinks it does, and it's going to cause so much chaos, harm, and bloodshed, and he wants to prevent that. So to prevent greater harm, he stands against, his nation's rightful ruler, his childhood friend, and technically his lord as well, and says, no, we're not doing this, and I will stop you to the extent that it takes, stopping short of killing him. So, yeah, I would say that neutral is definitely a big component, not because they don't believe in the laws of, kingdoms, their structures, their organizations, their forms of government, but because they see a larger picture with all of these different systems that are intertwined and interconnected, and throwing those out of harmony, out of balance, can cause things to fall apart really, really fast. So, the Avatar does not entirely disregard the law, rulers, and things like that, but they're seeing a larger thing where more than just laws are present and important. It's the reactions of people, the individual people, groups of people, things like that are taken into account for how the Avatar approaches things. So yeah, I think neutral is a pretty solid conclusion to reach there. And then, then there's the issue of personal philosophies. I always kind of hesitate with those because a personal philosophy is so malleable and can be discarded so easily sometimes. It's hard to hold to your virtues and into what you believe, especially if you're in dire straits. And even when you're not in dire straits, sometimes expedience dictates that you act in ways that maybe you otherwise wouldn't. So personal codes, personal philosophies, things like that, I always wait and see in those instances for how a player portrays their character. Are they actually holding to these things? Maybe a character is not beholden to a particular law, group, order, nation, kingdom, lord, lady, whatever. Maybe they do have a personal philosophy, though, that might put them more in a lawful alignment and category, but it just kind of depends, because personal philosophies can also be inherently totally chaotic, corrupt, or it's just full of malfeasance and all sorts of just little loopholes, like, I didn't break my rules, though. It's like, yeah, you didn't break your personal rules, but at the same time, you just lit an orphanage on fire and laughed as people came running out. So, you're not exactly a good person, or a law-abiding citizen for that matter, or very much worried about, an order to things. You are thriving on a moment of pure chaos and malice. Your character is not a good person. So, yeah, personal philosophies, super tricky, very, very hard to nail down and pin down. And, I could ramble on, clearly. I always give alignment so much thought, because it's one of those things, like I said, it's a useful tool. It can be useful, but it can also be restricting if it's applied too harshly, too stringently. Well, then you kind of start losing a lot of flavor and possibility in things, because you can absolutely have lawful good groups that end up opposing each other and going to war despite the fact that they're both lawful good. But if they're both just supposed to be this one definition and interpretation of what lawful good is, well, then they're essentially the same faction. Why would they be going to war with each other? If, you know, it can be too restricting if too stringently applied, but if it's not used at all, then it can be a free-for-all in some instances where players are, you know, just paying it no regard whatsoever, when maybe especially for some character types, that might be something that's much more important and can be used to get some great roleplay and character story and backstory involved, which is, for me, that's just like the highlight, is just telling a good story. So where alignment can be used well to tell a good story, I think it should be. Where it should be a little bit more loose, you know, it probably should be. Where that line is, that's hard for me to define. I think that's hard for anybody to define, except for at their own table, in the moment, and depending on what the story is, what the actions are, and how things are resolved, and how the aftermath plays out afterwards. Does the player feel guilt for their actions? Do they not? All of those things should come into question when determining a character's alignment. I don't see a whole lot of instances where players should automatically have to shift their alignments, especially dramatically, unless they've done something dramatic that warrants such a shift. But again, that's a very personal line there for each individual DM, and it depends on your players and how you want to rule things at your table. But what do you think? Go on to the comments down below and let me know your thoughts. Did you like today's video? Did you dislike it? Did my inane ramblings going down this twisting, turning rabbit trail yield any interesting thoughts or insights for you? And what are your own takes on alignment? Go on down to the comments below and let me know your thoughts on that as well. Certainly, it's an interesting topic. I think there's a lot of debate and discussion to be had there. Healthy and useful and constructive debate and discussion over it, but you know, just follow the number one rule: don't be a dick. And remember, if you're new here to the channel, go on down there, hit the subscribe button, and become a regular member here at the Gamers Den. Or if you've already gone on ahead and done that, go ahead and hit the like button and share the video far and wide. But with all that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. Thank you all so very much for your time, and you all have yourselves a good night.